In this video, we are going to discuss how to implement the authentication and authorization in .NET 8 Web API. This is a continuation of .NET 8 series. So, if you are new, please watch part 1 and part 2. Links available in a description box. What is the authentication? Authentication verify who the user is. Authorization. Authorization determine what the resources a user can access. If user have a read-only access, then it will access all GET API. If that user trying to access the create API, then it will return a 401 unauthorized response because you don't have a permission to access that API. It's called a role-based authentication. You can achieve this using a role-based authentication. Let's implement the JWT Bara token in our application. This is our application. If you are new in this video, so I am suggesting please watch part 1 and part 2 before proceeding. So till now, we have added our user, our hero controller and our hero services. And we are saving all heroes detail in a SQL database. So now I am going to add users in this application. For this, go to a model and create a user model. Go to model folder and create a user class. Select this model and press Ctrl+Shift to create a class. I am going to create a user class. Now user class is created. Let's add a property. So I have added these many properties: ID, first name, last name, username, password and is active field. If you want any another property, feel free to add it. Now next step to register this user model in our DBContext file. Let's open up our hero DBContext file and add a user as an entity. Now if you want to insert few entry in a user table, then you can add that entry in this on model creating method. So now I am going to add one user. So now I have added one entry in the user table. So that username is system and username also system and password also system. If you want, you can change, but for me I am going with system, username and password. Save it. Now our user has been registered in our DBContext. Let's add a migration. For this, go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager and Package Manager console. Click it. In this console, run add migration and migration command. Press enter. It will generate a migration file for you. Now, migration file has been generated. Let's run a update database command in a console to update user table in a database. For this, open a console, write update database and press enter. So now my database also updated. Let's verify. Open a SQL server, go to database. We are working in our hero DB. So just open table section. So here we have a two table, our heroes and users. Let's run a select query for a user table. So because we are inserted a system as a default user, that's why it's showing this. Now next step, for JWT token we need a secret key. Let's add a secret key in a app setting file. For this, open an app setting file and add one entry app setting. App setting contain a secret key. I am using this key. If you want, you can change it. Let's add an app setting model to access this secret key. Go to model folder, add an app setting class. This class have one property, secret key. Let's register this app setting class in our app. For this, go to program.cs file and here we can register our app setting like this. So for login, we need two model, authentication request and authentication response. Let's add both model in our app. Go to model folder and add a class, authentication request class. This class have two property, username and password. For authentication purpose, we need based on a username password, we are going to validate this user credential with your database. If credential is valid, then we'll generate a token and send back to user. Let's add a authentication response model too. So in a response, we are going to send a user ID, first name, last name, username, and token information. So our next step to add a user service in our app. For this, go to service folder and press Ctrl+Shift+A. User service, create one interface, and so now I have added a user service in our app. User service and add these method. We need a get all users method, get by ID, and if you want to add and update any user information, then we need to call this method, and for login we are going to call authenticate method. Now our interface is ready, so let's close this file. In user service we need a DB object, so for this let's add a constructor. In this constructor we are going to inject a app setting and our hero DBContext. So I have created a two private variable app setting and our hero DB object context, and we are injecting both, and after that we are setting up our user service is throwing an error because this method unimplemented. So let's add it. Implement all these methods. First of all, we are going to work in get all user method. DBContext already, so just call a return a DBContext and then call users method and filter out. So I am just returning all active users, so that's why I have applied is active equal to true. We are going to fetch all the users from database asynchronously. That's why I have added a async keyword here. So let's add a await to await here. Now let's implement the second method, get users by ID. For this, just return call DB object user and call first or default asynchronously. So because we are fetching the user information asynchronously, then we need to add a async await in front of this method. Await and async. So here we have an ID. So based on an ID, we are fetching the users in a database. If user does not exist, then it will return a null. It won't throw any error. So in a add and update method, first of all we have created one is success property, is success variable, local variable, and assigning as a false. And after that we are just checking if ID is there in this object, user object, whatever we are getting as an input. If ID is available, then if ID is there, then we need to update that user. If ID is 0, it means this is a new user, we need to insert in our database. So that's why we are checking ID equal greater than 0. If it's greater than 0, then we are fetching that user information from database. We are fetching asynchronously. That's why we have added an await and calling first or default asynchronous method. And if object is not null, means user is valid, we find out, then we are going to update a users, and then we are going to call a db.user.update and just providing a updated model. And after that we are calling db.save changes asynchronously to update a database. Update this entry in a database. If ID is not available in user object, incoming object, then it will execute an else condition. So here, because this is a new user, so I am just passing this object to our entity model, entity users, this object in our collection, and after that again we are calling a save changes asynchronous method. To it will insert this object in our database. Now let's work on this authentication. So in authentication method, we have a model, it contains username and password. So again we are calling a DBContext.user and calling a single or default asynchronous method, and here we are just fetching our username and password. If username and password is correct, then it will return a user object, otherwise it will return a null. If user is not available, then we are just returning a null response. If user available, then we are calling a generate JWT token method to generate a token for this. So in generate JWT token method, based on a secret key, we are getting a secret key, and after that we are generating a token like this. You can call a token handler method to generate a token. So here we need one object, security token descriptor. So here we have a 3-part: subject, expiry, and credential. So we are just passing that information, and after that it will create the generator token. So now our user service is ready. Let's register our user service in program.cs file. For this, go to program.cs and register user service in our app. Now let's add a helper method in our project and add a JWT middleware. In this middleware, we are going to extract a user token, and based on a token we are fetch user ID, and if user ID is valid, then we'll attach a user object in a current request. Add a helper folder. Inside a helper folder, let's create a JWT middleware class. Because this is a middleware, so we need to inject a request delegate in this class. So, and we need to call a invoke method and just call next and provide a current context to execute the next middleware. In this method, we are validating the token. If token is valid, then we are extracting the ID information, and we are trying to fetch that user in a database. If user, here we are extracting the user ID information, and after that we are passing this user ID to get users by ID method for getting a user object. So if ID is correct, then it will return a user detail, otherwise it will return null. So whatever we are getting, just adding that information in our current context. So let's call this method inside an invoke method. So for this, first of all we need a token. So call a context.request.header and pass a name of this header and extract the token information. If token is not null, then we are calling a raise user to context method to attach a user in our context API. So now our JWT middleware is ready. Let's add this middleware, register this middleware in our program. For this, go to program.cs and after user authorization, let's register this middleware. Now let's add an AuthorizeAttribute. So we'll apply that attribute in our hero controller to protect that controller. Let's add it. So go to helper class and add a model AuthorizeAttribute. And extend this class with attribute and extend this AuthorizeAttribute class with attribute and unauthorized filter. Here it's saying let's implement that because it's expecting an unauthorized method to implement. Let's do it. Because we already added in this AuthorizeAttribute, we are just checking if user context is available or not, because we already added this user context in our request in a JWT middleware. So we are just checking that object is available. If user is available, then no issue. If it's not available, then we are returning a response like unauthorized. So if user equal to null, then we are just returning a response. Context of result equal to new JSON result. We are returning the unauthorized as a response. We need to add an attribute users. So we are going to use this attribute as a class in a class of method label. That's why next I have added attribute target equal to class of method in attribute uses. So now our authorized attribute is ready to use. Let's apply this attribute in our hero controller. So open our hero controller and let's add authorized attribute here. So now I have applied that attribute. Attribute text is optional. If you want, you can add that also, but I am going to use a authorize only. So now I have added a protected whole controller. Means all the actions method inside the controller all are protected. Without authentication, it will throw a 404 error. If user is not authenticated, then it will throw a 401 error. If you want to protect a specific method, then you can, instead of controller label, you can go with the action method label also. But for me, I am going with the controller label. Now I have protected our hero controller. Now let's add a user controller tool in our application. For this, go to controller folder and add a new controller. Select the API controller empty. User controller and add this. So in the user controller, we need to inject the user service. So let's add a constructor and inject the user service. So I have created one private variable and injecting a user service and assigning this object to our private variable. Now let's add our get all users method. Return OK as a response. Inside a OK, wait and call the user service. User service dot get all users. So here we are getting all the user information and we are sending as a OK 200 as a response. All the users list with 200 status mode. Let's define this method as a get. Let's add a get attribute here. And because this is a user information, that's why we need to protect this information. So only authorized people only can access this. So let's add an authorized keyword in this action method label. Now let's add a post and put method too in this controller. So like this, in a post we are going to create the here just whatever user object we are getting, just changing that user object ID equal to 0 because this ID we are checking in a user service. So because this is a post, we need to insert this user as a new user. So that's why we are resetting this ID equal to 0 and then we are passing this object to the add an update user method to insert this user information in a database. In an update, we are getting a user object and we are getting ID as a URL. So here, so we have defined like this. So here because we are not using attribute, so by default it will accept as a parameter request URL. So here we have defined the URL, we are getting the ID, and whatever we are getting ID, we are just passing this. And body, users object we are accepting as a body. So just assign this user.id equal to ID. Just assigning this user ID, and after that again we are calling this method to update this user information in a database. Let's add a login method because this is an even and all. That's why we are not going to apply a authorize keyword in front of this other method. Here we are getting a authentication request model. It contains a username and password. So we are just calling this method and authenticating, generating a token if user is valid. If user is not valid, so it will return a null. So then we are sending a BAT request as a response. If user is there, then we are returning that user with information along with token. So now our user controller also ready. So let's run this application and test. Because we have added an authentication function, so better to accept this token, Bearer token in a Swagger. So for this, open a program.cs file and add a register Swagger generation inside the generation. Then accept inside the generation method we are accepting the authentication Bearer token. So here we are calling creating a documentation, Swagger documentation. So for me, this is a V1 API. This API version is V1, and provide a title and description. And here we are adding some security definition. So we are going to use a Bearer token security and open API schema. Now our application is ready. Let's run this. So after adding a Swagger generation, it will show UI, Swagger UI, it's look like this. Here we have one button. In this button, just click it and provide you Bearer token information. Then if you follow any API, it will work because we currently this API is not authenticated. So if you trying to access this API, any API, then it will throw an unauthorized error 401. Let's authenticate and then try. So for this, call a login API and pass system asset username and password and execute. It will provide one token. Just copy this token and go to authorize and paste it. Reload the double quotes at the end. Go to friend. In friend, just add a Bearer keyword and space. Click on home Bearer token. Define your token like this. So just write a Bearer space and then your token and click on authorize to authenticate. Now our API is authenticated. So let's close this pop-up and let's try our hero API again. Earlier it's showing unauthorized, but if you call now, so we are getting a response because current request is authenticated. Get file ID also working.